Hello, and welcome to today's Build Up Dietitians Live. My name is Stephanie Hodges, and I am a public health dietitian. I have a public health nutrition consulting business called the Nourished Principles, which you can find me on Facebook through that page, the Nourished Principles, and on Twitter, I am Hodges RDN, and on Instagram, I am stephaniehodges.rdn. And my website is thenourishedprinciples.com. So I'm really excited today to share about the dietary guidelines, which is in the middle of being updated now. So this happens every 5 years. A little bit of background about me. As I mentioned, I'm a public health dietitian. I've worked in the food insecurity, food access, child nutrition space for about the last 8 years. I've been a dietitian for 5 years, but I have really been focused on the food insecurity, food access, and nutrition policy side of things. I worked in state government before I started my business, and I have the pleasure of working with a lot of really great clients that include national nonprofits, some government agencies, school districts, and even some food brands and companies. So over the last couple of years, I have actually been helping clients be involved in the dietary guidelines process. This is something that every single private citizen in the US could be involved in. This is something that nonprofits can be involved in. This is something industry can be involved in. So there's really a place for everyone. But before I get into where the dietary guidelines are now, I would like to do a little bit of background on them. And if you are a dietitian watching this, you might already know this, but I'm going to give just a little bit of a refresher because they really are the foundation for all of federal nutrition policy. So the dietary guidelines for Americans started in the 1980s, and they are updated every 5 years. And they're updated by a advisory committee called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And this is really an expert panel of scientific researchers, nutrition researchers. They look at every single piece of nutrition research to update these guidelines. So it's a very rigorous scientific process. So a lot of times you'll hear about different types of influence and research studies, and I will say this is a really stringent process, and it's something that is looked at by a whole host of experts in this field. So they really are based on the best, strongest, and most up-to-date nutrition science, which is really great. So the dietary guidelines have been the foundation for my pyramid. We remember that over the years. And now we have my plate, which actually came out of the 2010 dietary guidelines. So right now we have the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines that are what we're working off of. And then this next set, which will be released probably towards the end of the year, especially since it's an election year, will be the 2020-2025 guidelines. So that will get us through the next 5 years, and they'll start updating those probably in 2023. It usually takes a couple year-long process. So this time, there were a few different things that happened for better or for worse. So this time, the two federal agencies that are tasked with updating the guidelines actually provided a set of predetermined questions for the DGAC to look at, which had never been done before. Typically in the past, the advisory committee set the questions that they looked at and the topics, but this time those questions were predetermined and they were provided to the advisory committee. And we'll get to that in just a little bit of where they landed with those. Some new populations that were included in the guidelines for the first time, which was really exciting. Birth to 24 months, so children under the age of 2. Previously, dietary guidelines were for anyone over the age of 2, so they would say these are for ages 2 and older, but for the first time they're putting together guidelines for those 2 and under, which is a little tricky, especially because when we think about the number of children who are breastfed, the number of children who aren't, complementary foods and beverages, and when those get introduced. So the committee definitely had their hands full with coming up with those recommendations. This time they also looked at pregnant and lactating women, so providing recommendations for that group of folks as well, which is also new and so important, especially as we think about the impact nutrition has, and it really starts in utero. So it's a really important population to address and provide recommendations for those folks. This time, the agencies actually provided updates along the way on dietaryguidelines.gov, which is a website where they put all of the predetermined questions. They provided updates on where they were with those questions so that they were either reviewing the science, they had created draft conclusions, or they had completed the review. So you can actually head there and look and see at all of the questions that they were tasked with looking at. So the idea was really to improve transparency by putting up this website and allowing folks to go there and reference information and see what's going on. So that was also new. They did have a ton of written comments that were submitted. I believe it was over 60,000, and they provided 3 opportunities for oral comments, which was really important. And one of those happened in Houston. So the idea was they were providing folks outside of the Beltway of DC to be able to maybe more closely travel to them, being that it was more central, but is what ended up happening is most everyone from Washington, DC just traveled to Houston. So I think that was a valuable thing to do, and I think there's definitely some lessons learned there. So now I'll kind of go into what is going on with the guidelines currently, and I want to preface this with the fact that the dietary guidelines really serve as a foundation for nutrition policy in this country. So when the WIC food package is updated, they base it on the dietary guidelines. School meal standards, when that goes up for child nutrition reauthorization, they look at dietary guidelines. SNAP Ed and nutrition education across this country relies heavily on dietary guidelines and so much more. So these guidelines really do impact every single American. They're what a lot of food brands and companies look to when they're coming up with product ideas. So they're really important, and it's really important that they are updated with the newest nutrition science, because we know how quickly nutrition science changes. Even every 5 years, it can change a lot within that time frame. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee released their scientific report in July. It was over 800 pages, and I had the opportunity to read every single page and really dig into the science that was reviewed and the recommendations that they came up with. So I'm going to provide just a few main high-level takeaways from there. One is that all of the guidelines really looked at the recommendation for a lifespan approach. So they didn't say, if you don't practice good nutrition before you're 18, oh man, you've really missed the boat there. They basically said there's always an opportunity to improve on nutrition, and it's really a lifespan approach. So how can we make sure that we are getting in all of the nutrients that we need and providing our bodies the best nutrition across the span of our life course? Another interesting thing that they did is they really looked at how this lifespan approach can impact future generations. So at one of the committee meetings, I believe it was the Birth to 24 Months subcommittee, it might have been a different subcommittee, they really spoke about their concern for young adolescent girls and how they were not meeting a lot of dietary recommendations and how that could potentially impact future generations. So when we're thinking about our bodies and women and how that we can really set up our children for success from a health and nutritional standpoint, they brought that up, and I thought that was really interesting to think about how it really is a lifespan approach, and how young adolescent girls, what they are, if they're meeting nutrition recommendations or not, and how that can impact future generations. A couple other key takeaways that the committee came up with. So for a while, the added sugar recommendation has been to consume no more than 10% of our total daily caloric intake from added sugars. And they actually recommended decreasing that to no more than 6%. And for children under 2, they said that there's actually no room for added sugars for that population. So I think we all know that Americans aren't necessarily meeting this 10% recommendation, but there was evidence to reduce it even further. And so that's why we ended up at the 6%. They also, which was a little bit of a surprise, recommended decreasing the alcohol limit for men. So the current recommendation is no more than 2 drinks per day for men and no more than 1 drink per day for women. And they actually recommended decreasing that limit for men to match the woman's recommendation. So no more than 1 drink a day. As you can imagine, this got a lot of pushback from a variety of different industry folks and others, so it will be interesting to see if this actually makes it into the final guidelines. It, alcohol has been deemed impactful on a number of cancer risks, so the research is there, but the folks speaking out and opposing this change were saying that the research that the committee looked at was based on one flawed study. So we will see what happens with alcohol, but that is definitely something to keep an eye on. Another thing is with the birth to 24 months subcommittee. So as I mentioned, the committee had a little bit of trouble coming up with this recommendation because of all of the variables in this population in terms of nutrition. So they really came up with this catchy phrase, every bite counts, and they said that we need to do away with the fact that food before 1 is just for fun. So really thinking about how when you're introducing complementary foods and beverages to young children, how we need to be reaching for those nutritious options. So fruits and vegetables, whole grains, dairy products, because they're providing a whole host of nutrients. So it's really important. They were trying to communicate that we are providing nutritious foods as first foods in this every bite counts. One thing they didn't look at that they had mentioned that they previously would is the how to feed. We know that there are a lot of products out there on the market that are pouches and different ways to feed, but they ran out of time and did not look at that, but recommended that future committees should look at the how to feed and not just the what to feed. In terms of pregnant and lactating women, they did specify certain nutrients that they are concerned about, but overall those recommendations looked very similar to the rest of the population. Obviously there were recommendations for fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and then also certain nutrients in foods that would contribute those nutrients for that specific population. Seafood was a really big winner throughout the guidelines for every single population. They talked about it in the birth to 24 months. They talked about it for pregnant and lactating women, obviously with the caveat to be aware of mercury content, and they talked about it for the general population as well. So I would say seafood was a big winner in the committee's report. It was hard to come up with these recommendations and not consider the world we're living in with COVID. So they did obviously speak to food access and food security and people being able to afford healthy foods, which I was really happy that they talked about. But I think that there's a lot of work to be done in that arena. They also spoke about culture and how important it is to take into consideration different cultures and different eating patterns with different cultures, which I think is really important in these guidelines, and knowing how some cultures might adhere to some parts and might not to others, and really just taking that into consideration. So that was brought up. So kind of where do we go from here? The committee's report came out, as I mentioned, in July. There were oral comments provided to the federal agencies last week. And so now the federal agencies are working on compiling all of that information, the oral comments, and then there were written comments as well in response to the committee's report, and that was due last week. So now they're really in the process of looking at all of the comments, taking all of that into consideration, and then the agencies, both USDA and HHS, will finalize the guidelines and put those out probably later this year. I think it's really important that we look at the publication of the guidelines as a first step. A lot of these government guidelines and documents are published, and what do we do with them? And as RDs, we have a really unique way that we can use them with all types of work that we do. I don't see patients one-on-one, but every time I'm talking to a nonprofit about how we can do nutrition education programming or advocate for nutrition policies, I kind of bring it back to the dietary guidelines and say, are we encouraging recommendations that look similar to the guidelines? So it's really important for this implementation phase. So this publication phase is kind of step one, and then implementation is step two. And that's really where we come in. It's also really imperative that the agencies look to a lot of partners, whether that's healthcare systems, industry, whether that is national nonprofits, other government agencies, to say, hey, we have these guidelines and we want to make sure that they're being used, because ultimately they are to help improve the health of Americans. Throughout the process, a lot of the comments talked about how the guidelines are for a healthy population. And when we look at the rate of chronic disease in this country, are they really hitting on some of those chronic disease prevention and needs? So that was a big focus of the comments of how do we make sure that guidelines are for everyone, knowing that maybe not everyone falls into that healthy category. So I think we'll see and hear a lot more about that, but I really encourage us all to pay attention to when the guidelines are released and to really look through them. In the comments, there were a lot of points about making sure that they're inclusive across cultures, across different racial and ethnic groups. And I think that that is going to be something to look for in the guidelines to see if that is addressed in the final ones. There was obviously a lot of comments about industry and also industry funded research. And I think that that's important to note, but I also think that we have to consider the amount of research that this committee looked at and know that it was based on, the best nutrition science. And also we have to think about who funds nutrition research. I mean, we know with COVID, public health isn't a highly funded sector. So when industry funds studies, that's obviously something to look at, but we have to look at it and say, okay, what were the results? What were the methods? And that's where RDs, when we come in with our science background and we're able to look and see, okay, was there influence? Was there not? And also being able to translate those results for a larger, broader population. So that's definitely something to look at and take into consideration when the guidelines are published, but just knowing that while industry does fund a lot of research, because frankly, who else does? We think about USDA and HHS. There's not a lot of funded nutrition grants out there. So a lot of times industry does kind of fill that gap. So just something to be aware of and think about, and encourage organizations and agencies to set aside funding for nutrition. It's really important, and it's something that we're seeing in all walks of life. So something to think about. And then also as they're going through implementation, thinking about as the next guidelines come up, where are the areas of opportunity that they can improve? Because there's always a comment period for everyone to be involved with. So if you aren't happy with the guidelines, there's an opportunity for you to voice those concerns. There's an opportunity for you to say, hey, I think that these are areas where we could improve them. And also to think about how the populations that you potentially work with could benefit from certain parts of the guidelines. So if you feel like, oh, I wish I would have been involved this time, don't worry, there will be an opportunity for you to be involved in the next set. And I really encourage you to do that. And you can actually go on to dietaryguidelines.gov and you can look at all of the questions that this committee looked at. Unfortunately, timing was not on their side. There were a ton of questions that they were tasked with answering, and they frankly just didn't get to them all. Some of the committees either pulled forward recommendations from the 2015-2020 committee, or they figured out a way to address the questions with research within their own subcommittee. So you can head there and look and see what questions were addressed, which ones weren't, and that might help answer some of the questions of how they come up with some of the conclusions that they did. But overall, working in the nutrition policy space, I didn't see anything too alarming. I didn't see anything too surprising. Obviously, the added sugar reduction, the alcohol reduction, and then just the birth to 24 months were all new, and something that a lot of folks were advocating for. So it'll be interesting to see what ends up in the final guidelines. But it's a really exciting time. It's a really exciting point in the nutrition space because these are updated, every 5 years, and they're really a driver for a lot of the change that we see and a driver for a lot of the programs that we see. So I'm happy to take any questions. I haven't seen any come in, but I'll stay on for just another minute or so and help answer any questions you might have about the guidelines. And if you want, you can go to dietaryguidelines.gov, and that's where you can look at the questions and things like that. And you can follow me for more updates on both Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can head to my website, and in the footer of my website are the links to all of those pages. So I don't see any questions coming in, but I'm always happy to answer them if you think of anything after. You can shoot me an email through my website or contact me on social media. So thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to keeping everyone updated on the guidelines and look forward to seeing them closer towards the end of the year. Thanks.